Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this EPRC webinar. My name is Carlos Mendez. I'm a director here at the European Policies Research Centre. I'd like to welcome Francesco Sindico from the University of Strathclyde Law School. Just to give you a brief overview of the format, essentially, Francesco will give us a presentation around 30 minutes or so, then question and answers. If you would like to make an intervention online, please just use the raise a hand function or the chat function, and we'll get back to these questions at the end. This is being recorded, so we can share it with colleagues after the meeting at a later stage. Please feel free to also share your views on the discussion on social media. So, a brief intro. Francesco Sindico is Professor of International Environmental Law at the University of Strathclyde Law School. He is the co-chair of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, World Commission on Environmental Law, Climate Change Law Specialist Group. He sits on the executive board of the International Water Resources Association, and he's the funder and director of the Climate Change Legal Initiative. Francesco has been working extensively on island law and policy related matters. He was seconded to the Scottish Government from 2021 to 24 to act as the lead of the Carbon Neutral Islands project. Give the floor to you, Francesco.
Start my own watch. Okay, thank you very much to the European Policy Research Centre for inviting me here today. It's been long in the making, let's say. As you said, I've been 3 years in government from 21 to 24, and it has given me this last almost year time to reflect on my experience there as an academic, as somebody working university, and broadly in island policy. If you can see, it's actually my experience with Scottish Government goes beyond my secondment. I started back in 2019 when I was asked as a consultant together with other people to contribute to the planning and the delivery of a consultation linked to the National Islands Plan. I'll mention that a little bit more later. I was then seconded. So seconded literally means you get all the perks of government. You get a phone, you get a MiFi that can give you internet anywhere in the world, almost got in trouble because of that. And it was an amazing experience. For 3 years, I was an official. I actually went to work at Scottish Government premises and so forth and so forth. That finished last year, and I am now still collaborating in some way, in particular with the Carbon Neutral Island project in one way or another, and with something called the European Islands Policy Network, which I'll mention later on. So I really want to bring a little bit of that in today's talk. But as you said, Carlos, I'm not working only as university. I have worked a lot with the International Water Resources Association on the Freshwater Islands interface. I lead a Congress series that takes place every 2 years on islands and freshwater, and we are in the setup of a task force within IWRA on islands and water. I have collaborated with IUCN as well in a number of non-academic related works, again in relation with SIDS, Small Island Development States and so forth, and with C2LI, the Climate Change Legal Initiative, the first social enterprise to come out of the University of Strathclyde. I have collaborated with, for example, the likes of the Overseas Development Institute, again, with Small Island Development States. So that gives you a little bit of my background. Now, there are 3 things I want to discuss with you today, and really keen to have also the discussion at the end. So I don't want to go too fast, but I do want to give us enough time at the end to have a bit of discussion. I will explain what I mean by islands in the context of this presentation. I will then clarify what I mean by island policy, again, in the context of this presentation, and then the big question, how to do island policy well. And I already tell you, I don't have the answers. I'm not that magician that I have all the answers to it. But I will reflect also based on my experience on 4 key ingredients to good island policy. So let's start with islands. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm not thinking of islands as sovereign states, like Malta, or like any small island developing state. I'm also not thinking of islands like group of islands or single islands that have a very high level of autonomy, like, for example, the Faroe Islands. I am thinking of islands in the context of a country or a state, depending on how you want to put it, that has also a major mainland area. That's the kind of islands I'm thinking of. So the kind of islands we have in Scotland, in Scotland, the kind of islands you see in Croatia, in Greece, in Ireland, in Finland, but also in Italy. Those are the kinds of islands I'm thinking. But even in those contexts, I am particularly interested in specific islands. So, first of all, think of Scotland, for example. Most of us here are either from Scotland or are linked to Scotland in some way or another. You have 6 local authorities that have islands, and there are 2 different groupings here, which are very important also from an island policy perspective. You have local authorities who are mostly mainland, both in terms of size and population, but also have some islands. Those are North Ayrshire, those are Argyll and Bute, and in particular Highland Council. Look how big the mainland area of Highland Council is, but then you have Skye, Rassay, and the smaller isles. You then have other 3 local authorities that are only islands, and these are Orkney Islands, the Condla, the Western Isles, and Shetland Islands. That's the panorama of islands in Scotland. But even within these 3, my particular interest, even from a research perspective, lies very much in these kind of islands. So I don't know how many have been to Orkney or Shetland, but in Orkney, for example, you have this island here called North Ronaldsay. The last time I was there, there are 50 people living there. And that's a completely different setting than Orkney mainland with or if you want, almost urban areas of Kirkwall or Stromness. Shetland, again, I've been very lucky and privileged to have the opportunity to visit Hula once. Hula is an incredible island. Only 30 people live there. And it's quite far away in the ocean to some extent compared to the other parts of Shetland. That's a completely different reality than Shetland mainland, which is also an island, obviously, with again the so-called urban areas of Lerwick or Scalloway. So, long story short, my interest, what has driven me over the last 10 years almost, from a research perspective, is how people living, not in the proximity of power, how can they have a meaningful voice, and how can that voice influence and shape policies that will affect their daily lives, from when you wake up in the morning till you go back at bed at night. That's the interest broadly. From a legal perspective, I'm interested in the legal and political processes that enable that to happen. Now, you could say, fair enough, Francesco, but how is this different from, say, here in Glasgow? If you live in Govan or Gorbals, you will have policies from Glasgow City Chambers down there that may not really recognize the reality of Govan, Gorbals, Partick, who knows where. Now, I don't have time in this presentation to come up with all the answers there, but I do think, and I do stand with this, that in the context of islands, there are some particularities. I'll give you 2 examples. One is from Fair Isle. This is a small island between Orkney and Shetland. And Rassay, this is Skye, which is an island off Skye. So, this is the bird observatory on Fair Isle. Beautiful place. This was gone down in a fire in 2019. It's finally, now, after almost 5-6 years, finally it's being almost rebuilt. I was lucky enough to see the process of this Fair Isle bird observatory being rebuilt over the years. And it was a story of contractors based, with all due respect for Leeds, I'm sure it's a beautiful city, based in Leeds, who really didn't understand where Fair Isle was in the world. They just didn't get it. It was a story of not understanding, again, the complexity of even just getting to the island and operating heavy machinery, say, on the island. All stuff that if you had just asked somebody from Fair Isle, even Shetland, it said, just give me 5 seconds and I'll explain it to you. And that doesn't always happen. Long story short, it took much more time than it should have. It costed much more than it should have. Things like this can easily happen even on the mainland. I'm not saying they don't. But in the context of Fair Isle, the simple thing as the ocean around it, to me, at least in my opinion, makes it an additional complexity. Rassi. First time I went to Rassi, they gave me a map. And they said, look at this map of Rassi. And then they gave me a map of Manhattan. They said, the size of Manhattan is exactly the same, square meter less, square meter more, than Rassi. And it also looks the same. Rassi has 225 people the last time I was there, more or less. It's a very vibrant island. If anybody has gone there, there's a distillery, there's an amazing hotel, which is also somewhat community, if not led, linked to the community. They're really, really vibrant island. Housing stock is partly old, and the housing stock needs to be refurbished, as in many parts of Scotland, absolutely. But buying or living in a house in Rassi is really complicated for those who are already there or want to move there. The additional complexity, again, is this stretch of water. For anybody who wants to go to Rassi and do work on an island, they will charge you, I'm exaggerating maybe here, twice, 3 times the price. The market competitiveness just to get there is either lacking or very difficult to overcome. Does this happen in other parts of Scotland? Absolutely. But in my opinion, having been there and support, it feels that in these realities, it's happening a wee bit more. It's a bit more complex. And really, to me, the big difference is, again, this stretch of water. Now, broaden out to the world if you want. Why do we have a difference between small island developing states at the United Nations and least developed countries? If everything is the same, that's ridiculous. Let's just all call them least developed countries. But if there is something called small island developing states, it's because the world, the UN, whatever you want to call it, has recognized that there is something like islandness that requires bespoke policies, whether it's at the United Nations level or at government level within a country. I'll stop there with that, but I just wanted to highlight that. So, are there areas that, despite what I just said, are islands without being surrounded by water? Yes. If you look at Greenland, if you live in a wee village of 50 people here, the only way to get there is by plane. There's no way. Some areas of Canada in the north, again, if there are no roads to get there, then you could say there's a similar islandness even without the water surrounding. So now we all understand what islands I am referring to. Happy to talk about other islands if you want, but these are the islands I have worked with here in Scotland and close affinity in other parts of Europe, as I will say in just a second. So now let me clarify, what do I mean by island policy? And this is where it gets fun, because you have a lawyer, you have an economist, you have an engineer in the room, you have all sorts of things in the room. And we all, to some extent, think of policy in different ways. So this is my take on policy. 2 things. To have an island policy, a country needs to have bespoke set of laws, rules, institutions, and budgets that focus on islands. But the second way of seeing policy is that a policy is the objective, is the goal of the government when it's setting up such laws, budgets, institutions, and so forth and so forth. So when I talk about policies, I talk about both things. Do we have those laws, et cetera, et cetera? Why do we have them? So when it comes to why do we have them, the word in Scotland, at least, has always been, over the last 8 years, if not more, island proofing. And this is very much about my own research interest, the having instruments to allow that voice of the people that either work, live, or are related to islands to be heard in government. And the way I see island proofing is both external, outside of the government, or internal, within the government. So when I think of external island proofing is, you live in Rassi, you live in Fair Isle, Pula, North Ronaldsay. Is there a system in place to allow your voice to be heard in Hollywood? And is it effective? When I'm thinking internal, it's you work in government in the agriculture department or rural economy or hydrogen department. Is there a system within government? You have never been to Dora Ronald, so you have no idea where it is in your life. Is there a way within Holyrood or London or wherever to get some sort of a feeling, of a sense of what life actually looks like and what the different realities are on Scottish Islands? That would be the internal island program. Next, do we have an island policy in Scotland? And my answer is yes, we do, since at least 2018. So this is, I won't bore you with too much law. As an old lawyer, I will have to bore you a wee bit with a bit of law. So in 2018, a piece of legislation focusing only on islands is passed in Scotland. This is called the Island Scotland Act 2018. It says a lot of things. I'm just going to focus on two because they are related to this island program. The first thing is that since then, we have something called the National Islands Plan here in Scotland. And this is the provision that sets out the purpose of it. Sets out the National Islands Plan sets out the main objectives and strategy of the Scottish ministers in relation to improving outcomes for island communities that result from or are contributed to by the carrying out of functions of a public nature. The next provision actually lists these outcomes for island communities. And you can think about it. It's digital, it's housing, it's fuel poverty, it's a number of things. Some of them are listed, others are there to be identified if you want. As I told you at the beginning, I was incredibly lucky to be part of the consultation that fed into the first National Islands Plan in 2020. Over the last 5 years, there has been a process, and I was part of government when this happened, where in 2023, a review started to ask ourselves, do we need a new National Islands Plan? And the answer was yes, we will have a new National Islands Plan. Early last year, 2024, again, I was still, the last month I was there, a new consultation started, not as extensive as the one we did in 2019, to start getting a feel of what were the priorities, what were the differences, if any, vis-a-vis 2019. And by the end of this year, all going well, the second National Islands Plan will be published by Scottish Government. Very, very briefly, I don't have any slides for this. If you look at the National Islands Plan previously, the first one, it's a big chunky document. We have tried to make it as streamlined and focused, but it expanded, let's put it like that. 13 strategic objectives, a lot of commitments. Everybody will say, be it somebody working in the council in the Conra, an island community person in Ferrari, even people in government, that it's too big. It's just too big. And most likely what's going to happen with the second is that there is going to be some focus, very much like what we saw, and I'll mention it in a second, in Ireland, for example. So this is happening as we speak. There's a second provision in the Islands Scotland Act that is really important, that is very important in the concept of island program. And this is the Island Communities Impact Assessment. Again, let me read with you very slowly this provision because it has led to a lot of misinterpretation. Our relevant authority, go to the annex of the Act and you have all the list of relevant authorities, public, government, and public, quasi-public, if you want, authorities. Must prepare an ICIA, it's called, in relation to a policy, strategy, or service, which, and this is the key, in the authority's opinion, is likely to have an effect on an island community which is significantly different from its effect on other communities, including other island communities, in the area in which the authority exercises its functions. When this came out, this was, I wouldn't go as far as saying revolutionary, but it is something that has been hailed as a potential good practice elsewhere. The idea that the moment Holyrood adopts a strategy on health, on transport, on buses, on who knows what, the government needs to also consider the impact on islands or even between different islands. This was not there before. This is huge. It's so huge that a lot of people read between the lines, ooh, this is great. I can trigger an impact assessment. I live in Farai, I live in Fula, I'm looking at what government is doing, I don't like it, and I can use this to challenge the government. That could have been an option, but that's not what the law says. If you like it, you would have said it's a missed opportunity. It would have been amazing if you could have an ombudsman or some sort of system whereby you can raise your hand and say, yellow card to the government, you need to have an impact assessment. That's not how it works. This is for the government and other relevant authorities themselves to commit to an impact assessment that focuses on island communities when they think it's going to affect island communities in a different way. So I'll leave it to that. But this is almost like the internal island proofing, educating yourself within government on when things are different for islands. So, is Scotland the only country in Europe with an island policy in the way I just explained? And the answer is no, absolutely. So, in clockwise order, in Italy, Italy has more than 100 or around 100 inhabited small islands. So this is not Sicily or Sardinia. Those are too big for my purpose. But there are plenty of other islands. More than 100,000 people, just like in Scotland, live on these smaller islands in Italy. In Italy, just 3-4 years ago, the concept of insularity or the principle of insularity has been included in the, we have it, a written constitution. Everybody happy? Not so happy because it's not very clear yet what that will achieve, what that will do. But it is a step forward. The insularity was not there 3-4 years ago. Now it is written in the constitution. So we have that seeds of island policy, if you want, in Italy. Greece. Obviously, Greece, even just for tourism purposes from the UK, we always think of islands. Actually, most of the people in Greece live on the mainland. But you do have a lot of inhabited islands, hundreds. You have hundreds of thousands of people living on islands in Greece. Greece has a ministry on maritime affairs and islands. That already shows you the closeness to the islands in Greece. The constitution, again, in Greece does have a reference to islands, and islands are mentioned in specific pieces of legislation, sectorial, for example, in climate change. And there's an initiative called Greco Islands, which focuses on that, on the resilience of islands, on the nature on islands, and so forth. So Greece is definitely an example where this has happened for quite a while. Finland has, nobody knows how many islands. Thousands of islands. But even there, in the inhabited, if you want list, definitely hundreds of them. Let's not think of the islands. That's 100,000 people with hundreds of islands. That's even just constitutionally, it's very different. But if we take all the other islands, Finland is a front runner when it comes to island policy. Finland had its own island legislation since the early 1980s. And when you're front runner, it's great, but you also have to adapt and you have to change. So Finland is, as we speak, in the process of revisiting its piece of legislation. So all going well, in 2026, Finland will have a new piece of legislation bespoke on islands. Ireland, obviously, is an island percent, but for the purposes of this presentation, Ireland has 30, I think it's 30 to 35, I don't remember the exact number of inhabited islands. Number of people are less than in Scotland, but still very important. And Ireland has done something really interesting because it doesn't have a bespoke piece of legislation on islands, but it does have, just like Scotland, a plan, a national islands plan, if you want to call it, on islands, that was adopted in 2023 after an extensive consultation. And compared to the Scottish one, it seems less huge. It doesn't have 13 strategic objectives, but very much it touches up along the same issues: repopulation, digital, housing, health, and so forth and so forth. The last I'll mention is Croatia. Croatia is interesting because Croatia, again, like Greece, we think it about the islands, but most of the people in Croatia don't live on islands. 100 odd islands, 110,000 people live on islands in Croatia, more or less. And Croatia, just like Finland and Scotland, has had a piece of legislation on islands for quite some time. Like Finland, it's in the process of revisiting it. It has developed specific island development strategies. Interestingly, on the coast of Croatia, there are territorial institutions that look up to the islands and provide that intel, very important intel for the islands. And because of the European Union connection, they have a healthy additional budget allocated to the islands in Croatia. So Scotland is by no means the only one. There are plenty of others. I was very delighted when I saw the list of people online. There's a colleague from Denmark who works and is linked to Islands Committee in Denmark, so I'll be delighted to be in touch with her to learn more about other realities in Europe. Now, this is my moment to share with you, and I'm delighted about this, with the three last countries. Scotland has signed a memorandum of understanding establishing the European Islands Policy Network. And what this network wants to do, and that's the Article 1.1 of the MOU, is to enable the exchange of good practices in the development, but also in the implementation of island policy. And I am delighted to say that the University of Strathclyde has been asked, and we are delighted to have accepted, to act as the secretariat of the European Islands Policy Network. And I know that the European Policy Research Centre, where we're sitting now, has plenty of experience working closely with European partners. So I'm delighted to bring this to the attention also of the centre and hopefully work together with you to make this as effective as possible. The idea of the network is to share experiences so that good island policy can be explained to other partners, obviously understanding that everything depends on context, but really to share that good experiences, which leads me to the last and final part of the presentation, which is what makes good island policy? How to do it well. As I said, I will disappoint you because I don't know. I don't have the answers. If I really had them, probably I would have stayed in government, I'm assuming, but I haven't. But there are four things that I have felt when I was in government, both as a consultant and on secondment, that I want to share with you. The first is you need to build trust and confidence in that island proofing setting between those who live on the islands or are related to the islands and those in government. Second, you need to have data to do good island policy and indicators to actually assess whether you're going in the right direction or not. You need to have strategic clarity. Really, really important. You need to understand what you're going or where you're going in the long, medium, long term with island policy. And last, ideally, you would have a bespoke budget, which is characterized, as I'll explain later, by additionality. So let me go through each one of these very briefly. So let me take you up to Shetland again. Shetland Council has developed, pursuing not so much the Island Scotland Act, but the Community Empowerment Act, a number of locality plans. And that means plans for the islands with small populations. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 in Shetland. In doing this exercise, they themselves highlighted that the key learning has been the building of trusting relationships. And that is as, if not more, important than any plans or strategy. So the way I see this is that in order for government to really be able, through the National Islands Plan implementation or through ICIA, Islands Community Impact Assessment, to deliver, people in government need to fully understand what it means to be on an island. That can only happen through listening and visiting each other. Now you would think, gosh, I mean, he's here just to say that you have to hop on a ferry and go there and sit down? Partly yes, but it's obviously more than just that. Now, take me as an example. I'm not an islander. I've never lived on an island. I have no clue about what it means to live in Great Cumbria or Yell or Rassie. But every time I went as part of the team, of the Scottish Government Islands team, I saw it as a two-moment thing. First, there's the punch bag moment. I mean, if you work in government, you need to be ready to act as a punch bag. And what I mean by that is you arrive there, and all the problems in the world, and this is probably the same if you go to Gorbals and if you are city council, the first few minutes are, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this is a disaster, and partly it's all your fault. And you just have to accept it. You just have to soak it in. And let's be honest, not all communities do it, be it island or city, but some do. And you have to be ready for that. Once that punch bag finishes, that's when the real listening starts on both sides. And sitting down and listening and taking notes and reporting back, very importantly, is super important. Now, it goes two ways though, and this is very difficult. Until I worked in government, I had no idea how Scottish government or any government worked. I now have much better idea, but that's because I was literally fully embedded Monday to Thursday in government. The speed with which things happen in government, the constraints, be it budgets or political, if you don't live them on a day-to-day basis, you will not understand them. Now, I'm not advocating for 100,000 people from the island to spend a secondment of a year in government, clearly not. But I do feel that in order to build trust and relationships, it's not just about the government listening to the communities, it's also about communities and stakeholders, if not operating within the government, having some sort of seat to be able to shadow, if you want, or understand better those constraints. In Shetland, I feel they have been able to do that. There are budget lines, there's the clarity, I'll get to that in just a second, to create that system of visits, both the council going to Fetlar and so forth, and for people from Fula to come to Shetland mainland, not just in Lerwick, and understanding each other. I feel that is a good practice that I have experienced firsthand, and that is worth either replicating or at least considering. Second, data. This I'll take you to my bigger work in government, which was the Carbon Neutral Islands Project. This was an initiative from the government to support 6 islands in Scotland to become carbon neutral by 2040. And the first thing we, in collaboration with island communities and with other stakeholders linked to the project, the first thing we said, we need to understand the emissions on the islands. We need to understand where we are starting from. And we had 2 options there. We could do the best audit in the world and wait for ages to get it, or we could go fast. I wouldn't go as far as saying fast and furious, but fast. And I stand with my guns. I don't think that's the right word, but we decided for the latter. We decided to try to get things done as fast as we could. Now, climate change is a particular thing. I see it as a climate crisis, emergency, call it as you wish. We don't have the luxury of time. If you're serious about it, you need to move fast. Maybe other areas are slightly different. And with data, this is not just about climate change or emissions. Often what happens on islands, and again, this is not just islands, either data is not readily available, or it's collected in a non-participatory process, often by consultants. I don't know why I'm saying always leads, but let's say leads. And that's not a good start. It's very important to listen to islanders and to, where possible, rely on islanders themselves to collect that data. Because there's a hell of a lot of capacity and expertise on most of these islands, despite the small numbers. So where I'm going with this is that, at least in the climate change field, I have arrived at the conclusion, not perfect world. Yes, we need data, but we just need good enough data for fast but just climate action. That would be all for another seminar, so I won't go into that, but I'm happy to expand. Data without indicators, that was one of the challenges with the first National Islands Plan, for example. Yes, they're somewhat linked to the National Performance Framework, but in my opinion, there should be more work linking the Scottish Government National Performance Framework also with the Sustainable Development Goals indicators, but everything has to be island-proof. Other side of the world, South Pacific brings us incredibly good practice with the UN Local 2030 Islands Hub and Hawaii Green Growth. The way they have localized the SDGs and the indicators is out of this world. They've done it for Hawaii, they've done it for Guam, they're doing it for a number of South Pacific Island nations. That to me is the way forward. Third thing, strategic clarity. Look, if there's one thing that I feel I have stumbled upon when I was in government, and probably happens in every government, was answers to these questions. I tried asking this question on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I worked at the university, I went back and asked it on a Monday. Is the work of the government intended to create a platform for jobs to be created through the work of the private sector on islands? Or is the work of the government to identify those areas, services in which the private sector does not have an incentive to operate, and in those areas, services create and maintain jobs needed for the prosperity of islands? Or is it both? And if it is both, where in the earth is the demarcation line? I have no better clarity after 3 years. And I don't want to get too political here, but I do think this is a huge problem. If I don't understand where my government is going, if I don't understand what the line is, or if it's both, and it's absolutely fine, give me some clarity on these islands with characteristics X, Y, Z, we go this way. On that island, we go that way. On this part of the mainland, we go that way. But without that, it's very, very difficult to operate. And the trust and confidence also is undermined. But to me, this is hugely important. I was thinking about it this morning. I'm assuming I'm not the only one in the room. If there is somebody, fine, we all respect each other. That is somewhat bamboozled of what has happened in the US over the last 3 weeks. Having said that, gosh, they have strategic clarity. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Public sector jobs, bad. Too much money, too much time, cut. Everything to private sector. I may not like it, but gosh, that's clear. I mean, that gives you some sort of direction. I don't want that direction, personally speaking, but I do feel that I personally was lacking those important answers to these questions. Last is about budget. Now, I was actually thinking about this, happy to hear what other people think. One would think, if we don't have budget, this is all useless. I mean, yes. What I would say, however, it's more about the moment you are in government or a university, you will find money. There are budgets laying around. The question is to try not to replicate budgets unnecessarily. If there is a budget about heating, and it is applicable also to islands, let's work on bringing that budget to the islands. However, if the islands have, again, the island proofing, additional complexity, additional challenges, that's where the additionality comes in and needs to fill in that gap, that stretch of water that makes it more expensive, for example. Some things are already there, I'm not saying there aren't, but there needs to be more focusing on, we create a new National Islands Plan, and I'm pleased to say this is happening. The last I've seen, the new National Islands Plan is taking this additionality in mind, and that is a good practice, to link it with, let's focus on budget where it's needed, where it's additional, and where it can be transformative. And that is a good practice as well. So I'll finish by reminding us what this was all about to some extent. It starts over 10 years ago with my own line of inquiry, if you want, and this interest from a legal political processes to enable this voice to be heard more. I've clarified that, at least in the context of this presentation, I'm not focusing on all kind of islands, more the smaller ones, if you want, within the context of a mainland. Island policy can mean two things, as I mentioned, and these are the 4 ingredients that obviously would need to be expanded a lot in the discussions and papers and whatever. Trust and confidence, data indicators, strategic clarity, budget, and additionality. And the last thing I want to say, and then I'll close, is that being on secondment for almost 3 years, moving from literally moving from this building where I started 12 years ago here at Strathclyde, 13 years ago now, being thrown literally in the mouths of government, working behind the minister in a debate in parliament and so forth. and then getting a 4.5-hour ferry from Melbourne to Castle Bay and Barra and talking to the community there has been, if not the most rewarding experience of my professional life, amongst definitely the most interesting, challenging, and fantastic experience. I am a lawyer. I did very little law here, to be honest. I mean, it was more policy management, community engagement, climate action, and support. But it did make me think, what happens after you have a piece of legislation in order to implement it? How do you get to a piece of legislation? How do you amend, say, regulations about ICIAs and so forth, trigger, not trigger, as I mentioned before? And now that I'm back in university, and I'm delighted to see some of my students here as well, I really want to teach in a slightly different way. I really feel that a lot of what I've seen in government goes at a speed which is completely different from what I'm used to in research, in teaching as well. The collegiality within government, within teams, I've never experienced something so nice. You have 8 hours to deliver a brief to the minister. Everybody gets together, usually on Teams. But the amount of information you can collate between people working in the same team, good luck trying to do that in university. So I really appreciate that. And at least in the public sector Scottish government, that was something I will always cherish. And I will try as much as possible to bring it within the university as well. Stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Francesco. That was a really fascinating presentation on the particular challenges facing small islands geographically and in terms of population challenges. Also, the specific example of Scotland, the case study, as well as a comparative perspective comparing with other countries across Europe and beyond. And finally, on the key factors shaping the effectiveness of island policy, in particular, trust with the citizens, speaking to them, communicating, data, valuation, evidence, and finally, budgets, the specific concept of additionality and having a clear and focused strategy. And we can open now for questions from people in the room, also online. Please also introduce yourself and your affiliations.
Thank you. I'm Nigel Lindsay. I used to work for the Scottish Government in European structural funding. Thank you very much for an informative and thought-provoking talk. I learned a lot from it. Could I ask you to say a word or two about the place of the political and constitutional representatives in this process? Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles are slightly overrepresented in the Scottish Parliament in terms of the proportion of the population they represent. And of course, their MPs, the councillors in these areas, have an important part to play in island policy. Could you say a word or two about how easy it has been to recruit them into the process and what role they might have in implementing it?
So just as every island is different, every local authority is different. I'm maybe biased in referring always up north to Shetland, but I was lucky enough to be given the task, especially for the last year and a half, to be the islands team, not responsible, but liaison officer with Shetland. So I really worked very closely with the leader, with the people at the highest possible level in Shetland. And I did feel that in Shetland, there was the political will within Shetland to put budgets and resources where they felt it was necessary. Now, I'm not saying the other local councils didn't do it, but I do think in Shetland there was that strategy, that clarity. I saw it much more there than elsewhere, let's say. The extent to which they collaborated, say, with government in Edinburgh, I do remember, so practically twice a year, there's the Island Strategic Group that meets. When I was there a lot online, but now starting to meet in person, where the leaders of the councils get together in Edinburgh and so forth. And there is engagement. There's a lot of engagement in that sense. And again, the same thing I said about communities knowing how government works, even within local authorities, I think that would be very useful. And there's a little bit of that, but there should be more of that. When I went up to Shetland and sat for a day or two in the offices of the council and had, even just the informal coffee with the climate change officer, with the small island population officer, that was incredibly informative for me. and I try to bring it back to my colleagues in government. That's very soft, not soft power, but soft skills, if you want. But I believe, and it's not just islands here, clearly, that those soft skills, it's difficult to put it in a paper, you know, it's not just about a coffee, but actually those are really important.
Thank you. Are there any more questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, you kind of had mentioned that there's sort of a lack of direction potentially, and government is a big problem. So two-part question. Do you feel like that's a UK specific issue in your experience? And how do you think you can create a clear sense of direction and policies?
I have the answers for that. You know, I feel as much as Carlos mentioned comparative, yes, I work very closely, especially with colleagues from Finland, from Ireland, from Croatia, but I don't know enough. Hopefully in a few years' time, as secretariat of the network, I will know more, but I don't know enough about where they are going to answer fully that question. In the UK itself, again, that's where the constitutional aspects, a different kind of institution, Scotland, UK-wide, oversea territories, that's like three worlds, you know, policy in Edinburgh for islands, policy in London for islands, including the Scottish Islands, policy in London for Channel Islands, Isle of Man, policy in London for the oversea territories in the Caribbean. I was surprised. I would have thought the islandness would bring a little bit more of that together, but I feel that's very disconnected. There has been a little bit of efforts, even in London, to bring this island dimension together, not as much. How to get that? That's a political challenge. That's a generational challenge. That's looking at political parties 50, 60 years ago. You may like them, you may dislike them, but you know what they stand for. Do you know what your political party stands for today? Probably not. The fact that we change from one political party to the other in a whim, that's already a sign. You know? I mean, surely if you have some values, you should stick to something. But it's not like that really anymore. So I don't know. I mean, I really don't have an answer. And the last 3 weeks, as all of you guys, I mean, I'm shaking a little bit. If you had asked me this question 4 weeks ago, maybe I would have had a different answer. But now it's really, really complicated to answer that question. But it's important to ask that question. Because the problem is we have stopped asking that question. And coming from Italy, I think we have another Italian in the room. In Italy, this has started many, many years ago in the early 90s. Politics was equated with bad and corrupt and everything. And to me, even in the UK or elsewhere, that is a political objective. The beauty of working in government, to me at least, was that from an official perspective at least, 98% of the people, and I'm sure it's the same in Italy or Spain, are actually there because they want to be. Are actually there because they feel that they are committed to doing a job which will lead to impact on Fura, Ferryle, Gova, and Gorbos. If not, you would do something else. But since the early 90s in Italy, the idea is, oh, if you're in politics, that's because you're that. And this is exactly what's happening in the US. You know, everybody working at USAID or Department of Energy surely is somebody who's lazy, corrupt, and doesn't want to do what. But that's a political objective of certain elites or powers, probably. And I'll stop it.
Okay, do we have any more questions? There is one online about whether the locus of decision-making power, just a bit further up on the chat, but whether the locus, whether there's authority, public government authority on the actual islands and how that can impact. Are there any moves in that direction? So decision authority by policymakers locating to the islands or having representatives on islands. Could this work, or are the islands too small?
So whether on the islands themselves there's decision-making power, you mean?
Precisely.
Okay. So again, it depends what islands you're talking about. So in the Western Isles, for example, I often remember that obviously you would need to have the map there, but you have the big island, if you want to call it that, Lewis, where the capital is, Stornoway up here. And then it goes down, 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 and it ends in Barra and Battersea. And even within that context, the farther away you are from, not Edinburgh or London, the farther away you are from Stornoway, the same democratic deficit is not the right word, but I know what, it's that idea that they're not listening to me up there. Now, the way to challenge that, in my opinion, and I'm not saying it's the right way, but it is something that has puzzled me ever since I set foot, not just on islands in Scotland, but in the UK, is that if you go to Italy, for example, and you go to a place called the Aeoli Islands, an archipelago of islands north of Sicily, you will have an island called Salina, which will have, I don't know, 600, 800 people, or Lipari, 1,000, and there's a mayor. Now, everybody hates the mayor, fine, from right, left, up, down. But that mayor has been voted in by the people of that island. And that mayor, more importantly, has enough money to actually see that that's his or her job. That, in my opinion, is missing here. That level of local representation as a job in many places is missing. You have community councillors. That's a whole other issue in islands and other parts of Scotland. And there's not enough budgets, public money into professionalizing the role of politician on small islands or even small villages anywhere. That to me is a problem. Because unless you have a mayor, you may hate it, may not, who do you even go to talk to? That trust and confidence is a really big chicken and egg situation. Because I go to Island X and I say, I want to really build this trust and confidence. And now I have to choose between the 20 of you who I'm going to start that with. That first decision is huge. If you have a mayor, it's easy. You'll go to the mayor. Now, if you only speak to the mayor, you have a different set of problems. But at least you go to a specific person in Apistareia in Greece, in, I don't know, Lipari in Italy, in Vic, wherever it is in Croatia. Here we don't have that. And that to me is a problem.
Thank you. Is there anybody online that would like to ask a question? Please just unmute yourself and others can raise their hands.
I have a question. I'm Alan Hooper. I'm an architect and teach at Glasgow School of Art. In your work, do you ever come across architects, designers, makers, artists who offer a spatial perspective on ideas as opposed to a legal policy?
Where's Laurie Brinklow? You have Laurie Brinklow from Prince Edward Island. She's an artist. She can answer. No, and it's not a joke. First, I'm very delighted to put you in touch with Laurie because Laurie is literally the person to ask that question from a Prince Edward Island perspective in Canada, but she has worked and traveled all around the world and she can tell you so much more. I actually started my work on Ireland with the Glasgow School of Art. So a Royal Society of Edinburgh, it was called Arts, Islands and Resilience. And it was focusing on North Uist in particular. And I got fantastic opportunity to meet the very wide community of artists in North Uist. But because I'm not an artist myself, I'm not an architect, I cannot really answer that. What I can say is that, again, take Rassi as an example. So Rassi has this beautiful house / hotel, and behind it, it has this incredible old, I like to say Victorian, if it's not, I don't know, but greenhouse. And it was in shambles. And the whole idea was, let's, with assuming architects or spatial planners or whatever it was, let's bring it back to how it was, but in a way that makes sense to the community, in a way that helps the community re-bring to life that beautiful thing that they had. And now it's amazing in a way that a lawyer obviously could not do. So I do think, and this is what a lot of people will say, again, of islands, but probably not just of islands. The communities are very close and very knit. And if you are one of 260 people, and one is an architect and one is a psychologist, surely you'll talk. Now, it has also its challenges, but that kind of everybody working together and moving in this direction is something I see very closely, not on all islands, but in some islands. So it's not really an answer, but I'm happy to put you in touch with Laurie, and you can discuss with her.
I'm a PhD student at EA Center for Energy Policy here in Strathclyde. My question was about one of the points that makes a good policy, so the need for data and KPIs. Do you think that there is in place a system which allows for accessibility to data among researchers in different areas and based on different geographical areas. I'm thinking about the islands here in Scotland and the rest of the UK, and for them to be available to data, or do you think there is space to improve?
There's definitely space to improve. Data is very scattered. There's a lot of work to just bring everything under one roof, one webpage. So there's a lot of work to do there. The experience I had is that through the Carbon Neutrality Project, we have collated, the island communities have collated a lot of data, be it from peatland, from housing emissions. In some cases, it has been done literally on a household level. It's incredibly granular, literally from door to door, and really getting the most precise data that you can. In other places, it was started on a much more broad level and then trying to focus on it. But that is a massive challenge. If you go to the, let's say, nationwide databases, you almost go by postcode, and that's all skewed. There were some somewhat, if they weren't tragic, almost funny exercises where, for whatever reason, a llama ended up in Yell, which is a small island up in Shetland. But because this data was generalized for the whole UK, surely there must have been a llama up there. And it seems like a stupid thing, but actually it really bothers people, rightly so. And it's this, whether it's ignorance or not capacity or not time, be it in government or not government, from Central Belt, from Glasgow, to understand that things are different out there. We do have a big challenge there. My question, however, is, do we always need the perfect data? And when it comes to climate change, the more days pass and the more I tell you no, we just need to act.
Thank you. We've got a question from Robert Leslie, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yeah, it was just on that point around the island communities impact assessments that you made earlier, and I do recognise that there was a lot of excitement that these were going to be carried out on every single policy that came out, and then that wasn't the case. But do you feel that having that kind of challenge mechanism from the communities is key to building trust with the Scottish Government, from the Island Authority point of view? And do you think that there are policies that have been put in place that have been poorly implemented due to the lack of these impact assessments?
So, Robert, what I would say is that ICIAs, despite the fact they've been there for 4 or 5 years now, are still a little bit of an experiment, if you want. And you can have two ways of seeing this. Either it's a failed experiment, and from be it a community or a local authority or anywhere, you just say, I don't trust it, I don't believe it anymore. I don't think that's a positive way of seeing it. Or you take an approach that we now can build on the experience and make it much better. If we take the second approach, however, you again have two options. The first option is we build it as it is today, which has, in my opinion, even from a legal perspective, some limitations. Or we open up a policy discussion on maybe not going as far as allowing island communities to trigger it, which could be revolutionary, but have a system at least of greater transparency is not the right word, but allowing, again, to the data, allowing anybody to easily find these ICIAs, which, at least in my opinion, are not that easy to find. They are there. You just need to ask a lot of people. But actually having that bank of ICIAs could be a really good practice, because there has been some good things happening. There have been some policies that maybe people don't even know have been amended ever so slightly to take into account island communities' interest. And that has only happened because of an ICA that actually happened mostly in the government offices. But really, there has been a little bit of consultation. Now, the problem is that if ICAs were done well, every single small thing about peatland, about airports, about health, should require a consultation of over 6 months with everybody. That's never going to happen in the current budgets and the current reality. So we need to also find, not cut corners, but also be realistic on what the consultation can actually be in the context of a specific policy that needs an ICIA.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any more online questions? There's around a minute left. The rest of us can continue the discussion after over coffee. Just one final question.
There's a few questions online in the chat. Maybe we can ask the people either to unmute, like there's one by Stacey Alvarez, a comment also by Adele Litterdale, and now Sarah Baird as well, but just a comment. I don't know if you want to unmute. Probably it's easier for others to hear you.
Yep, I've asked it already.
Stacey is
Feel free
unmuted.
to unmute.
Stacey is unmuted.
Hi there. Hi, Francesco. Thanks for an amazing presentation. How are you doing?
Very well. I know.
Great. Yeah. I'm joining from Barbados, and I thought the comment you made when you outlined the body, I forget the acronym, that is taking an integrated approach to policy in the EU, and I thought that would be something that is really needed in the Caribbean. But I wondered your thoughts on what kind of challenges do you think might be, is it something that's easily transferable to different regions, or is it something that, would have to be steeped in realizations of the islandness that is different in each region? Just a thought off the top of my head. Thank you.
First of all, I'm really, really sorry you woke up for this, Stace.
No, I'm used to it.
I know we worked together. I know you're an early riser, but still.
Yeah, it's all right.
So if you were talking about the European Island Policy Network, the one that has been established, I feel that you need to give us a bit more time because it literally has just started. So I hope to tell you in a few years, it's working great, it can be replicated, blah, blah, blah. I do have my doubts though. Because I don't know the Caribbean enough, so you would be the person to actually tell us to some extent. But also, let me remind you that this has in mind countries with a big mainland and islands connected to it, okay? In the Caribbean, you have a geographical dimension which is very different. Barbados is one island, so there's no such thing. There are some islands like St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where the Grenadines would be that kind of smaller islands with the respect of St. Vincent, where you could start thinking along these lines. So I don't have an answer, but I'll be happy, and obviously we are staying in touch, to maybe touch base in a few years, well, earlier for coffee, and discuss it once we have a bit more practice going.
Great, thanks so much. Thank you, because I'm actually from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and I'm doing some research there now, so yeah, that would be great.
There was Adele, I think.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Adele.
Hi, that was really interesting, Francesco. It's great to hear. For the last few years I've gone, just based up in Orkney, I'm doing some research on the Islands Plan as well. And I just wondered if you had any insights over the last few years about, how archipelagos kind of operate in this network, and you're kind of establishing this island network. And whether that might be a strategy to inform policy as opposed to kind of splitting islands off into individual units.
So, Adele, obviously, there's been a lot of research from colleagues. We also know about really truly identifying that every single island is different, but there are some commonalities that may not be linked to the geographical pertainance to Orkney, let's say. And that one, say, North Ronaldsay may have particular realities that are more similar to Lismore for whatever reason in Argyll and Bute. That may not be the case, but still. The extent to which you can then transpose that classification of islands to a policy dimension where, say, if island is of group yellow, an ICAA will be done in XYZ. If island is of group orange, ICAA will be done in a different way. I mean, on paper, it looks amazing. And you can even go to ref and get a 4-star and everybody's happy. Whether it actually works in reality, I would have much more doubts on that. So I don't really have an answer there. I do feel that, but you're the expert, well, you live in Orkney, you know more about Orkney. I do think that you have a similar situation in Orkney, Cornwall and Shetland as in Scotland, where you have this feeling that a lot of things happen around the mainland, But then in the smaller isles, the council is less understood, less heard, less present, less visible. But even there, I feel that in Orkney, but especially in Shetland, I have seen good practices trying to counter that island proof thing that is apparently not there. But that's how I would put it.
Okay, we're past the hour now, so I think we're going to finish. Thank you very much, Francesco, for sharing your really interesting and fascinating insights on small island policies and the challenges and the effectiveness of policy. Thanks everybody for coming and for participating online and here. Just to let you know that we do have another webinar coming up in 3 weeks on the 19th of March by Stephanie Vedder from the German Federal Institute for Research on Building, Urban Affairs and Spatial Development on a related topic in terms of data, worries and satisfaction using subjective indicators to map inequalities. So please do contact us and register for this seminar as well, and we'll keep you up to date on future events. Thank you again, especially to Francesco.
Thank you.